Sorry, I didn't see it.
Let's just leave it like this.
That's fine.
Yeah, I would just leave it like this for right now.
Let us know. Have you pushed it live yet?
No.
Ruthie, yes, you have. Okay, guys, we're live. Okay, Mayor, we're ready.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'd like to call our special call meeting at 2 o'clock to order. Welcome Jack Pringle. I see Jack also online. Sorry for any inconvenience. Joe's online. Okay, and all of you are there. The purpose of our meeting this afternoon is not to make a decision. Jack is here with us to share really the update of the information that he has been working on relative to this rate increase from KIU. And Jack, just to clarify, all of this is preparatory to our council meeting next week, or are you expecting us to make a decision today?
Mr. Mayor, first, thanks for everybody getting together for this special meeting. I actually am hoping that a decision gets made on this settlement proposal today.
Okay. All right.
The reason is because the actual merits hearing is scheduled to take place unless the parties come to a settlement agreement and there are some deadlines. And I can talk through that at the appropriate time.
It's all yours.
And Mayor,
Okay.
and Jack, if I can say, and Mayor, on today's agenda, we have it posted for you, have discussion and approve. So we do
Okay.
have it
Oh, okay.
titled today
Okay.
for approval. Consideration.
Just by way of background, and some of you may be familiar with previous Kiowa Island utility, or we've been calling them KIU in the rate case, but that from time to time, KIU will file a rate case or a request for a rate increase with the South Carolina Public Service Commission. They did so in the fall of this year. And originally their request sought, and I know I'll throw a lot of numbers around, so I'll try to keep them to just a few and just some of the more significant ones. Their rate increase request sought $1.355 million in additional revenues, meaning that the difference between what they are currently charging their customers, their water and sewer customers, and what they would charge under their proposal, they would earn $1.355 million more dollars as a result. The town intervened in the case, and there were a couple of other parties, including the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff, or ORS, which is a state agency that audits and reviews the proposals and operations of utilities like KIU. Also intervening in the case was the South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs, or the Consumer Advocate. And both of these parties, ORS and the Consumer Advocate, asked a lot of discovery and did a lot of review of the KIU proposal. And the parties also, following some of that discovery, pre-filed testimony, which is essentially putting the evidence that they plan to present at the hearing in written format prior to the hearing. And the mayor submitted some testimony, in particular to oppose one aspect of the rate case, having to do with some roughly $2.5 million of expenses associated with the second water line construction. Then the parties engaged in some potential settlement discussions or trying to figure out if there was a way that they could amicably, without a full hearing, to resolve the case. And as the result of some back and forth, what the part of these parties, including ORS and the consumer advocate and the utility, came up with or are proposing, and that's what I'm putting to the council and to the town for discussion and approval, is that, and these are the high points, of course, is that instead of earning 1.355 million in additional revenue, the company would agree to earn $555,000 instead. So you can do the math on that, what the percentage that 550,000 is of 1.355 million, but it's a substantial decrease in what they sought initially. It's in total, it's a 5.76% increase in revenues. Just by way of comparison, in KIU's last rate case, which was also resolved by the parties, including the town, they got a 6.0% revenue increase. That was in roughly 2019. And before that, there was also a settlement that the town was a party to in 2017 that resulted in KIU getting a 14.5% increase in annual revenues. So that's just by way of context and comparison. With respect to those expenses associated with the second water line, the settlement would allow KIU to put $1.8 million of that 2.5 million on its balance sheet, but as a regulatory asset. And this gets into some public utility economics, but they would not be able to earn a return on that regulatory asset. And the reason that is important is, and I should have mentioned this at the outset of discussing this, because it is something that has been a concern of the town and some of its residents in the past. KIU has agreed to be regulated as a rate of return-based utility, as opposed to via the operating margin.
Okay.
And for those of you who are CPAs and have financial backgrounds, that is important, and it has been a point that some residents of the town have raised. And that's important because for a company like KIU that has a fairly high amount of assets, somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 to $30 million in plant and assets that have not been fully depreciated, it's much more appropriate for them to be regulated as a rate of return based utility as opposed to operating margin, which was what they were before. So they have agreed now to be regulated in a way that befits their operations. And like I said, they would not be able to recover a rate of return or have any carrying costs on that $1.8 million regulatory asset, which is lower than 2.5. And then in addition, and this also gets, they had asked for a higher rate of return on equity, somewhere in the 9s and the 10s. They agreed to have a return on equity of 8.69%, which was, like I said, coming down off what they requested. That number, rate of return on equity, is usually hotly contested in these rate cases. And generally it means that a utility has a cost of equity and what is that number. And then they also have a cost of debt. So there's a mix of equity and debt that goes into their return, but that was the part that was hotly contested. And as a result, there are some other adjustments, some other requirements that didn't reflect the finances so much that ORS was requesting, but those are the high points of what the proposal is. One other point to make is that the base rates for water and sewer will not change as a result of this settlement. The changes that would take place would be in those usage-based services, consumption. As you may know, there are base rates for water and wastewater, and then there are charges that are for the incremental or marginal use. And those are all going to be in the water service, and none of those will be in wastewater. But so base rates don't change, but there'll be some incremental increases in things like water use for golf courses, irrigation, and the like. I'll pause here for a second we can discuss, or I can answer questions, or we can talk more about this.
Jack, just to clarify, the 5.76 is an aggregate rate adjustment of highs and lows, and it nets to 5.76. But then the 8.69 in terms of the rate of return on equity is moving forward, or with that, that's from a little bit, so with that rate adjustment of 5.76 will generate that level of revenue, that level of income, that then when you compute a return on equity, it comes out to 8.69.
That's right, but I think it probably sort of works the other way, is that the rate of return on equity that has, that would be applied to their rate base, their plant and service, the physical things that they own, is those factors would then produce the revenues.
That was my
Yeah.
question. Which
Yeah.
comes first? So effectively, what we're agreeing to is an 8.69 return on equity, and then when you go back through the calculus, you come up with a 5.76% increase. That's what moving from an operating margin to return on equity does. Is that correct?
In part, yeah. That's instead of having an operating margin, which is essentially taking a look at revenues over expenses with a little bit of variation on that. Yes, you're right. It's and it takes into account, as I mentioned, that they have a substantial amount of of plant and service asset, and that's generally in the regulatory accounting world. That's the way you should be regulated. And then frankly, the only reason that you're supposed to be using an operating margin is that oftentimes when you inherit a system that has been already completely depreciated or other kinds of circumstances, and KIU is completely different, doesn't fall in under that kind of approach.
So then to my question that I had asked you regarding how does the 5.76 stack up against other rate increases, let me ask you, how does an 8.69 return on equity stack up with other utilities?
It varies. The commission just recently approved an 8% return on equity. There have been companies in the recent past. There was a 7.44. There have been others that are a little bit higher. I was actually going to pull up. There's some that have gone as high as 10 and 11. So it's in the range for sure. And part of that, I think, that approach upping theirs up a little bit had to do, and I know that there's not a direct connection with this, but the fact that the Fed bumped the federal funds rate by 0.25%, had something to do with them going up just a little bit. That's, again, I know that there's not necessarily a direct cause and effect for that, but this is within the range of ROEs that the commission has in contested cases and certainly in resolved cases, they've also been in this range.
Scott Parker here. For those of us who are numerically illiterate, can you just bottom line this for me and tell me this was the rate increase they were looking for and this is going to be the rate increase that they will achieve?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Their rate, they originally sought $1.355 million in additional revenue. And that by the settlement, they are receiving $550,000 in additional annual revenue.
Okay, maybe I didn't state the question.
So let me give it a shot, Dr.
Yeah.
Parker.
Yeah,
So as a homeowner,
yeah.
on their original submission, how much more would my water bill have been versus with this settlement, how much more will my water bill be?
That question, and I know that you don't like to hear this from attorneys, that involves a lot of assumptions in terms of how much you're using and what your base rate is.
But they always publish a thing that says that the average homeowner can expect. So what is the average homeowner expectation of the original increase versus the resulting increase?
I'm not sure that number has been published anywhere. But I can give you, let's see, the best way to sort of go about this. As I mentioned, your base rates will not increase at all. There'll be increases on water usage for consumption, sort of in the 10.97%. Let me see if the notice actually said, I mean, to my knowledge, and there was a lot of testimony filed, I don't know that there was this is what the average customer will pay.
Yeah, there was a number that related to the 1.355.
I thought it was 14.
And I think I think that's what everybody is asking. The 5.76 is an aggregate number that
Right.
has highs and lows and usage and the like.
Yeah,
And that relates to $550,000 worth of additional revenue.
correct.
But there was a percentage that related way back when this was first introduced,
14.
that related to the 1.355 million. I want to say it was somewhere in the 8-9% range, but I don't have all of that in front of me.
I remember them
Well,
coming and
okay,
saying that they
I
had a
know
percentage increase
what-
that we could expect.
Their initial request sought an increase of $1.355 million, resulting in total revenue of $10,973,000, which was a 14.1% increase.
That's the number.
Yeah,
That's the number. I think that's what you were.
Yes, that's what I'm looking for. And now
Okay.
what's the delta then off of that?
yes. And so it's, 5.76% instead of 14.1%.
So if someone comes to me and says, how much is our increase for water? Is it 5.7% or is it 8.6?
It's probably not, that 5.76 number is an aggregate.
That's the
Your
555,
base rate for water will not go up a cent.
but usage will.
The flat rate you pay every month will not go up a cent. The wastewater or sewer rate you pay for base rates won't go up a cent. Your consumption rate for sewer won't go up a cent. Your usage rates for, like, I'll just give an example, for water, for consumption up to 11,000 gallons per month, your residential from $4.83 to $5.36.
And that's all, that's very clear. But when I get my water bill, I don't look and see that my base rate stayed the same. Wow, I feel good about that. I look at the lower right-hand corner of the bill that says, I'm gonna send them a check for $100. The component structure of that, quite honestly, is irrelevant to me on a day-to-day basis. I understand what you're saying about which pieces will change. And so so I think what we're all looking for is that number in the lower right-hand side of that water invoice. What is the likelihood that that's going to go up 1%, 5%, 10%? And previously, would it have gone up 14% because that's the component that was the consumption of the water? And that's, I think, what we're looking for is what does that number change in the lower right corner of that bill?
Well, I guess one way we could do it is, if you're somebody's bill you have that has the numbers in terms of what your consumption was, we could do that math.
Is that consumption?
Based upon, because what is changing is that if you're doing consumption up to 11,000 gallons a month, you're going to pay a little bit more. If you're doing between 11,000 and 50,000, you'll pay a little bit more than that. And if you have consumption over 50,000 gallons a month, you'll pay a little more than that. The best way to think about it is that the additional revenue is going where there's more usage and more consumption.
Right. So the homeowner who conserves more water will be relatively better off because the base rate doesn't go up. The homeowner who, for whatever reason, uses more water will see a relatively larger increase because it's going to be based on the consumption number, not the fixed flat rate that we all pay. And it's the consumption only of the new water, not the sewer water or the other water, right? So it's tilted in the right direction if you want people to be thoughtful about their usage of water.
Unless the resort is concerned about their golf courses.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so in bottom line here is the various agencies and yourself have worked together, have come up with something that's a reasonable plan that reduces off from where they were before, gives certain protections and to our ratepayers and our residents, and still allows KIU to do what we all recognize they need to do, which is to make enough money to continue to service the area.
Makes sense.
Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement, and I think this is a reasonable settlement with all of what you mentioned that factors into it. That takes their needs, the ratepayers' needs, the ORS and the Department of Consumer Affairs concerns about the ongoing viability of the system and looking for ratepayers too. So yes, I think it contains all those concerns and falls into a range, as we discussed, of where these types of resolutions and decisions of the commission have been in the recent past.
Then my next question is, what is our role in this?
We have to approve this.
We have to approve this settlement?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, the town is a party of record, and so we are, as a party of record, we be, called upon to sign off on the resolution and then be part of the group that presented it to the commission for approval.
Okay.
Got it.
So is it time
Jack,
for?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Jack, one additional question or two. Their base revenue, I didn't get it right, 10 million what? 10 million?
They sought total revenue of about 10,129,316. You can see what they ended up getting.
No, they
It is
stopped
less
revenue. They stopped revenue of 1.355 million.
That's right. That's what their additional revenue.
It was on a base of 10 million something.
It's as it would, the aggregate, that's what the final number was after the increase.
No, you just pulled it up. You had it just a few moments ago.
They saw total revenue of 10,129,316.
No, they said total.
Excuse me, sorry, looking at the wrong thing. They saw total revenue of 10,973,313.
That's their base, okay. So for us, it would have gone up between 10.9 up to 11, 12, almost $13 million. It's going to go up substantially less than that, only that 576. So we really haven't, like Dan had just explained, it's difficult to make that comparison to a homeowner's particular bill because of all of those other factors. So I think we just have to be careful in explaining this to the homeowners, that the key is the fact that it is not anywhere near as high as it could have been, or would have been if their increase would have been approved and we wouldn't have intervened. I guess that's the point.
So I went back while y'all were talking and looked at my consumption of my water bills for the last year.
Yeah.
And just the consumption portion. And my bills would have, depending on the month, my bills would have increased anywhere from $2 to $4.50 for the month on a bill of $95 to $175 total bill. So to me, it's relatively small as it impacts the consumption line on the invoice. And so the number in the bottom right doesn't go up very much.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
And what
That's
were,
good. And certainly, to your point about how this would affect residents, it's certainly something between now and when they get implemented could certainly, as you just did, to, sort of run some numbers,
Yep.
averages to
It's
say.
it's pretty easy to do.
This.
Because
Yeah,
they
yeah.
isolate the consumption number pretty easily, so.
yeah.
Yeah.
So what the settlement is also saying is it's a 40% of what they had asked for settlement based in a direction that helps the smaller user of water.
Right.
That's where we are.
For sure.
Seems to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would agree.
I was like.
Jack, why did they want that 1-point-some million of the second line to fall into their balance sheet? We had suggested a number quite a bit lower than that.
Oh, yeah.
How does that fit into that going into the
Yeah.
asset?
I think, and this gets well beyond my, I don't know what, I'm not even sure what pay grade is, but I always say that. But that it was important that, even if it wasn't going to be considered as part of, for utility purposes as part of rate base, they, I guess they, this company, seeks investors and, seeks financing in the equity and debt markets, and that, there's some degree of importance to having, that be shown as an asset that's used and useful for providing water and wastewater services. I mean, I think they would have been most happy, and they were, I think, disappointed not to be able to have the whole thing on there, but felt strongly that that's what they had to pay to get it done. But I think there was just some sense as, just for, the way for, I wouldn't say necessarily just appearances, but what that means for the way they show or the way they present to the markets and such.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions of Jack?
Mr. Mayor, when council no longer has any questions, we have someone from the public that has a question.
Sure.
Okay, you can go up and state your name and address for the record and just ask your question.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Hennessy. I live at 12 Blue Heron Pond Road. Thank you for taking my question. And thank you for dealing with this, which is, I think, a horribly complex and opaque subject for most humans. I did have a couple of questions that I would ask you just to consider. I don't propose that I know the answers to these questions. Number one, moving to a rate of return on equity sounds reasonable on its face, but I don't know what the implications of that are longer term, whether that means, for example, that rate increases in the future are simply a factor of how the owners run the utility and therefore rate of returns and therefore automatic, or whether the rate making process has changed in some material way. So I would just ask you to think about, okay, what is the changing status of our water rate pricing structure to rate of return on equity actually mean over time? Secondly, I guess I think sometimes in commercial negotiations, one side will come in with, a really big number, and then we negotiate down to 40% of a really big number, and we feel good about that. I personally don't think that's the right way to think about this. I think the way to think about this is to look what comparable communities and comparable water utilities charge and are being charged, and to look at our situation. I mean, one simple thought is that large water utilities have risks of non-payment and water disruption and so on and so forth. Is that the situation here in Kiowa? I don't really know, but I do think it's a very important concept, and something that the community is looking for is, okay, forget about the 40%. It was, 100%, now it's 40%, whatever. How are our homeowner rates compared to, pick your favorite comparable. I don't even know what the right comp is, but I think that's what people want to know, that we're getting a fair deal, and a fair deal as described by South Carolina or Charleston County or whatever. I think I heard that the proposal in front of the council here this morning would mean that we wouldn't have a full hearing. And I'm not sure if I heard that correctly, and if I did hear it correctly, what that means. Why wouldn't we want a full hearing? And as a subcategory of that, what does the state consumer advocate say about this? Do they say, hey, this is really a good deal, you guys ought to grab it? Or are they silent, or have they not answered the question? So I guess I'm impressed that the South Carolina utility functionaries are involved in this and helping us through the complexity. What do they think about this deal? And then maybe the last point I would make is another really important dimension in terms of fairness relative to other communities. Are we getting a fair deal between the commercial users of water and water-related services and homeowners? I have no idea. But that's a really important element of the economics here, is who's paying what. And again, I appreciate the fact that it's a very complex question, but I do think it's one that we ought to have a good answer to. That's it. And again, I'm not an expert, but I think this is a big deal, and appreciate your spending time on it and taking my questions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Pringle, if you can answer or address any of those questions, that'd be great.
Sure. Great questions and a lot of great attention to these issues, and I appreciate that. I think taking them in order, addressing the moving to rate of return and what that means. The commission has to approve in every rate case, whether it's contested or resolved, as we're hoping to do here, has to approve the rate of return. So in moving to rate of return, and it certainly approves any operating margin that the company has too, but the best way to describe it is that rate of return on equity has been hotly contested in several rate cases over the last couple of years at the Public Service Commission, and has become a mechanism where, you know, the commission can really, I don't want to say reward a company, but can affect a company's rate case and rate case application by the rate of return on equity that it chooses. So I think that all of the things being equal, that moving to rate of return will provide a little bit more of those levers or those tools for the commission if it determines, for example, that, and it did this in a recent case, and you can find this up at both at the commission and at the South Carolina Supreme Court, approving a rate of return on equity of 7.44% for Blue Granite Water Company. And the rationale for that was in part that based upon customer testimony and some other evidence, that the utility was not being particularly well run. So what I mean is that then that rate of return can be a lever or a useful tool in order to incent a company to improve its customer relations and its practices and otherwise. Moving to your point about how to evaluate the potential settlement, you're right that it can be perceived or that a utility decides to essentially, shoot the moon and anchor things at a very high number, mindful that perhaps it will get resolved over the course of a case. I'm not the only one way to contextualize that, and I think I mentioned this at the beginning, was that in the two previous rate cases where there were resolutions that took place, this proposed resolution results in a lower revenue increase than in the two previous rate cases that KIU had. In one, they got 6% in additional revenues. In the one before that, they got 14.1. Not a perfect gauge, but one way of seeing that, that's not unreasonable, and that coming off of where they started was important. Another point about that is that it's difficult to compare rates in one utility system to those in another, in part because you have different rate bases and you have different assets and different circumstances. And it also becomes somewhat problematic to compare to a municipal water system, for example, in part because municipalities have the ability to do things like issue tax-free bonds and things of that nature. So, but those are good points. I think the fact here, the relatively, yeah, I'm sorry.
It was nobody. I think it's Mr. Ladriola's wife talking.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Should I keep going?
You can keep going.
Yeah, okay, and then the question was, well, why don't we want a full hearing? And that's a great question. I think the reason that, and as I mentioned before, the commission would still have to approve this settlement as being in the public interest, which means that the parties would take these terms and this information to the commission and say, you know, through this process of negotiations, some give and take on all sides, we've come up with a resolution that we believe is results in just and reasonable rates and that is in the public interest. And so, but the commission would still have to evaluate that. I think the reason that the parties decided to do this, some of the same reasons that in commercial litigation context or other disputes, you decide to resolve it. You're still kind of controlling your own destiny. And instead of facing the risk, you know, from our side of the table that KIU got everything they were asking for, this comes somewhere in between. And there's also a time element to it because the hearing would take place, then the parties would submit proposed orders, then there would be, you know, the time would pass. So there are certainly some things that are given up when there's a negotiation, but the fact that the commission has to approve it and the fact that, you know, frankly, that everybody comes away a little bit unhappy is kind of an indication that perhaps it's a pretty decent settlement. And then finally,
Jack, excuse me, in terms of the benchmarks, the comps, you did talk about that. The 5.76 had some comparisons, but the key number was that 8.69, the rate of return on equity. And you did mention this one utility that had what, 7.64?
7.44, yeah.
44, but then you mentioned that there were other ones. I think that's the number that Mr. Hennessy was looking for. How did the rate of return on equity for this particular situation compare to others? And because then.
Yeah, well, I think by contrast.
You did have a number, you did have some comps, as I recall.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one difference between, at least on this record, with Kiowa and, you know, perhaps with Blue Granite, and I wasn't really in that case, I was sort of a party, but didn't go to the night hearings and stuff, is that there have not been, to my knowledge, you know, a lot of any complaints with the way this system is being run. As a general proposition. By Blue Granite, by contrast, they've had some historical problems in certain areas. They've bought a number of systems and pulled them together. So, but like I mentioned, there are other instances where the commission has approved ROEs that are higher than 8.69. And I guess my point is that the rate of return on equity is, like I say, a lever that the commission has used in certain instances when there's substantial evidence that perhaps, you know, the utility doesn't merit something that's higher. Does that answer your question? Okay. And then the last question you all had was about a fair deal between the commercial and the homeowners. Also a good question. I think by and large, the way things are set up, given that there are a great many more residential customers than there are commercial customers, generally speaking, there are sort of more of, although there are a fair amount of irrigation, I guess, a lot of the revenues come from residential customers because that's where the biggest base of potential revenue is. But it's, and that's certainly something that the ORS, you know, considered about this, the balance between, and the utility also did a cost of service study in connection with this docket that was looking at which customers and what type of service were the real, the cost causers for the utility, and trying to, and these numbers and this settlement was truly trying to more accurately match up where the utility's fixed costs were and then where those revenues were that recover those fixed costs. So that is moving towards those ideas of, you know, are commercial customers paying the right amount? Are water customers paying the right amount? Sewer customers, et cetera.
Any other questions from the public? You have any questions? No, Mayor, we'll have anyone else have any questions from the public?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so, we've heard from Jack, and we've asked our questions. So you really would like a motion from us to support this, correct, Jack?
That is correct.
Yes, if you want to read, Mayor, on the agenda, a motion to approve the settlement agreement between the parties of record, that's on your agenda?
Yeah, if you could read it, Steph, I couldn't
Yeah.
get that
Oh,
printed, so I
okay, no
don't
problem.
have, that's what I don't have
Um,
in front of me.
Well, you guys have it, so if anybody want to make a motion.
I'll accept them,
Well, someone needs to make a motion.
I will move.
Go ahead.
You have to read
Just read
from your
that.
agenda.
I will.
Okay.
I move that we approve the settlement agreement between the parties of record in the Kiowa Island utility rate case pending before the South Carolina Public Service Commission.
I will second it.
Okay, any other further discussion? Any other further questions, comments to Jack? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay. You have it, Jack.
Well, great. Well, I appreciate the special meeting, and I appreciate all the input too. And I, encourage. Those are some really great points and thoughts about whether it's about conservation, whether it's about usage, and so those kinds of things will be great for the town to continue to pay attention to as KIU continues to operate, and those things. Will come up in the next rate case undoubtedly. So good on you for all that input and attention to this. Great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all
All
your
right,
work.
thank you
Jack.
all.
Thank you,
Okey-doke.
Jack.
Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. See you shortly.
See you shortly.
Hey, Chair Wilson, you're still there? Can we